Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Mind Matters. Today we're going to be talking about a book by TC Lethbridge called The Power of the Pendulum. This is the book. It's a rather slim volume, 150 or so pages, maybe a little less. TC Lethbridge was a Cambridge kind of a archaeologist, explorer. He served in Cambridge's University Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology for a number of decades. So he was an academic. One of his responsibilities was to keep charge of certain objects. But he was also something of a naturalist. He had a very intimate relationship to his environment and a pretty strong curiosity about nature. So later on in his life, he kind of veered off into subjects related to parapsychology and questions of the mind and psychic ability, and wrote a number of books in addition to his more academic studies that explored those ideas. I had heard of using the pendulum as a way of acquiring a kind of subconscious knowledge of where things were, kind of like a psychic Geiger counter of sorts. I never really gave it much thought or gave too much credence to the idea, I guess because I hadn't read too much on it. But this book, The Power of the Pendulum, really makes the case for the possibility of there being something to it. And what really kind of grabbed me right off was the nature of his writing and the introduction to the book, The Power of the Pendulum, by Colin Wilson. Colin Wilson was a prolific British author. He had written The Outsider, The Occult, and a number of other nonfiction and fiction novels that were well regarded.
Yeah, like the Mind Parasites was one of his novels.
I was just getting to that, Harrison. Oh. I would not have left out the Mind Parasites. Harrison just brought up this other novel that is a little favorite of mine called The Mind Parasites, where Wilson posits the idea that there's, it's really a story. He doesn't present it as a nonfiction study. But the idea is that that the world has become kind of attacked by this parasitic, non-physical mind virus that affects the thinking of the world and creates all of this kind of global destruction and catastrophe by design. So anyway, Wilson was filled with all kinds of interesting ideas that he seemed to pull out of the information field. And he writes a glowing introduction to The Power of the Pendulum because Wilson was also very much interested in the kind of nuts and bolts workings of parapsychology and mysticism, and the people who were proponents of ideas that might otherwise be considered fringe, but that were so powerful that they made it into some mainstream awareness. So, like I said, he writes this glowing introduction to Power of the Pendulum that kind of hooked me in right away. And like one of the ideas that drew me in as well as I started to read this book was how Lethbridge, first of all, he's got a great sense of humor. He writes everything in a kind of a light manner. But the book was written around 1970, published in 71. It was the last of all of his books. It was edited by his wife and their cousins. And it was I think his kind of encapsulation of a lot of the ideas that he felt were the most pertinent to his career as a kind of a student of psychic ability. and parapsychology. And what's fascinating to me, one of the things, is that, and we'll get into the whole idea of what the pendulum is and how we connect to certain natural laws and things that exist in our environment via this psychic use of the pendulum. But what was really fascinating was the number of times, and really early on too, that he goes on the attack on neo-Darwinism and the kind of classic ideas of evolution that we were all brought up with. And I was thinking, by that time, yes, you had some studies in science that pointed to the idea that neo-Darwinism is BS. But he was able to, almost 50 years ago and earlier, come out and say that neo-Darwinism is bunk, and the reasons why. And so I feel like it's all of a piece. It's like you have to kind of understand in a way that materialism has, through neo-Darwinism and through a lot of other ideas, limited our scope of thinking about what reality is and what our relationship to the environment is, and that there is a kind of a life of the mind or a super conscious, separate from the subconscious. He makes this distinction in the book that we can tap into via tools like the pendulum, the dowsing rod, and just sheer observation of those things. So he encouraged a lot of observation. He encouraged a lot of kind of experimentation, and says, basically, if you're a materialist, hardcore, and you don't have any questions that come naturally to you about, where, what we are as humans and what we're capable of outside of our five senses, then this stuff isn't for you.
Right. He was really just you get an idea of who he was in the introduction that Colin Wilson writes, and then also throughout the book and some other of his writings where he talks a little bit about his upbringing. And he sounds just like an extremely adventurous, free-thinking, well-rounded person who, he spent in his younger years, he said that he got a skill for observation from being raised around a lot of hunters. And so when he was always having to pay attention to everything in his surroundings, everything that would signal, a wounded animal and which direction the animal had went and how to track that animal. And then also he had politicians in his family. And so they trained him to spot people's reactions to things that were being said without them noticing that he was gathering information on how they were reacting to, various, hot topic issues or, just different things that came up in conversation. And then Colin Wilson says that he was kind of a loner. He got married, before he was married, and his mentality was really he was a very independent person. His two loves of his life, up until his research into the parapsychology and ghosts and ghouls were archaeology and the sea. So he wrote a book on coasts and coast men and different things about just the natural life of just people down to earth. And he was, like you said, he worked at Cambridge, but he kind of had a love-hate ambiguous relationship with them because, clearly he was a man of quite a bit of intellect, if not just through being independent, just thinking and, following things wherever they led, and not being, biased in terms of what he would or would not consider. He was but then he said that, Cambridge was kind of suffocating, and then it was just not. It was like he loved it. He loved Cambridge and he loved everything that had to do with it. But at the same time, he just also had that free spirit that finally, when he was able to leave, he was able to devote himself into the study of ghosts and ghouls and ancient religions, and just basically able to say all sorts of things that he never would have been able to say in a quote unquote respectable academic setting. And in this book, you really get an idea of what his world philosophy is. He really pares it down into 116 pages or something. You get an idea of how he views our point in time in history, the major dilemma between materialistic randomness, the point of view that everything comes about randomly versus the idea that everything is created, and how that was such a dilemma for mankind. And his attempt to grapple with that dilemma led to experiments in this, higher dimensional parapsychological area, so that he could ascertain for himself, using those methods that are taught and tried by materialistic whatever science, but then applying that to so-called religious studies. And it's a little, some of it is a little bit out there. I don't know. I mean, because some of his conclusions and that he draws from, this pendulum swinging, I'm like, you have to have a very gifted imagination to draw the conclusions about different higher dimensions because of the length of a pendulum string and how many times it rotates and how many times it spins. I'm not a trained scientist, but it seems to me that, when you start saying that the higher dimensions are involved, it's very inspired in some sense, and it lends credence to just how open a mind he had to things that are para, or not supernatural, but paranatural, I guess.
Like, I guess you could call it a vast inferential leap many vast inferential leaps that he makes. But oddly enough, they kind of make sense in a system like that he provides or kind of creates for himself or discovers through his own use of the pendulum. But maybe before we get into some of his more out there ideas, just a little bit on the pendulum itself. It's kind of like dowsing, right? Because, a pendulum, you've got it's like a plumb bob, or, it's basically a heavy object on the end of a string. And it rocks back and forth. Like you said, it can make spirals. It can go back and forth, just like a pendulum, in a grandfather clock or whatever. And it can be used to find things like dowsing rods. You have dowsers that look for sources of water to dig wells, for instance. And the dowsers are still used for that purpose. It reminds me of of an anecdote I heard, not relating to pendulums or dowsing, but you'll see how it kind of fits in. It was about a famous quantum physicist, I believe, somewhere in Europe. And a journalist I believe it was a journalist. Sorry, I don't remember the details of the story absolutely because it just came to my mind, but had gotten invited to go out to his farm, basically. And so they go out to the farm, and the journalist notices a horseshoe, like above the door, and says, "Oh, that's pretty superstitious. Like, do you really believe that?" And then the physicist said, "Oh, well, it's one of those things that works whether you believe in it or not." Right? And that seems to be the approach that a lot of people take to dowsing. Like, farmers or people who live out in the country and need a well built, they'll call the dowser to do it because even if they don't believe in it, it seems to work. And that's why that's why dowsers are still, sought after, because it seems to work. Like, they seem to be able to find water. And so it seems similar to the pendulum, because me too, I'd never really known anything about pendulums until several years ago. But then I've only had I've had maybe 2 experiences with the pendulum. And one came out just as a result of kind of whimsy. So we were doing some house renovations in the basement and installing some walls. And so we had to nail down these 2x4s to the concrete, foundation, essentially, the basement floor. And we were using this drill to drill in the screws to hold down these boards. But the concrete was, first of all, it was kind of spotty. Like, some parts were a lot harder to drill through than others. And wherever we'd look for a spot to drill through, we'd hit these hard bits and couldn't drill through them. We'd be standing there for minutes and get a quarter of an inch down. Mm-hmm. And so we're just like, well, what are we going to do? This is crazy. Like, this is the only drill we have. So I just thought, well, it can't hurt. So I got out the plumb bob that we were using for, just to measure the, to get some lines straight when we were putting the boards up. And so I just kind of told myself, okay, well, I'm going to start it spinning. Or start it swaying back and forth. And then when I get to a spot where where it will drill, I want it to stop. So I go and I'm just going along the 2x4 and it's going voop, voop, voop. And then I get to a spot and okay, it stops. So we drill, it goes in, and we do that like 10 times and it worked each time. Whereas before we were having zero luck. Like we couldn't drill any of these holes. So I was like, oh, well, that was interesting. A fun coincidence. Was it actually working? Well, it worked, whether you believe in it or not. Whether there was actually something paranormal going on, that's another question. But the one of the interesting things I found about that was that it was like a need-based thing. Like there was no other way we were going to find out where these were unless we were going to drill hundreds of holes to try to find which one would work, and that was just like that wasn't going to happen. So it's like there was no way to test for it. So we used this weird divinatory method to try to find it out, and it ended up working. Another time, but then again, another time I was looking for a missing object and just got nowhere, didn't find it. Mm-hmm. Right? Someone else found it totally not in the place where the pendulum was telling me it might be. So, and like Colin Wilson says in his introduction, it's like Colin Wilson himself didn't have any luck with the pendulum. Like, it didn't seem to work for him. Mm-hmm. But Tom Lethbridge seemed to have a knack for it. And it seems like that's the thing. Like some things work better for some people than others. And, in a lot of these parapsychological phenomena, like whether it's, the like remote viewing, some people are better than others. Any different like micro field that you find in wider parapsychology, you find people who are better at it than others. So the question I have about, so I'll leave like his system and some of his conclusions to the side for a second. Maybe you guys can pick up on that after I finish just this one point, is that he comes up with all of these conclusions about like everything from these experiments he's doing with the pendulum. And that, it makes me wonder, first of all, whether they're repeatable by other people. And I'm not sure if anyone has tried to like verify whether they can get the same results that he has. And the reason that's a question for me is that I wonder if the results that he got, and leaving like even assuming or just accepting for the time being that they're true in some sense, that the results that he got might be not necessarily objectively true in the sense that anyone with a talent for the pendulum, if you can call it that, would find the same results, or if they were like a system that was specific to him and his mind. Because I was reminded of, I think it was in the first Sight book by Carpenter, I can't remember for sure though, but where he was describing how some of the psychics that he was, whose work he was quoting, seemed to have very specific like routines and conditions under which things would work. So they each had kind of like their own style or personality of the overall system in which their phenomena would, come about. So I'm wondering if the system of results that Lethbridge got were more of like part of the structure of his own mind. It's like that on some like super conscious level, like he might say, mm-hmm. that it really did all this categorization and like systematization so that he was like discovering these things, but that were put in like kind of like his own particular language.
Mm-hmm. So I would say there are a few different answers to that. He had conducted these experiments mostly on his own, but he also did them with his wife, he writes. And there's one experiment that he engaged in with, I think, a friend as well as his wife, where they were dowsing for, and maybe perhaps using the pendulum to determine certain elements of a very large stone. And they were doing this in coordination, and yes, they were using dowsing rods. And there was something in the response to like his friends using the dowsing rod that was a reaction to Lethbridge's own detection of this element. I think it is, and this story might have been in one of the other readings. There's some good compilations of Lethbridge's work in other places, so that might not be in this particular book. But so that's part of the answer. There was, at least among Lethbridge and his wife and people and intimates that he shared this research with, a consistency. And there was certainly, he claims, a consistency within his own research that he claims again and again was repeatable. And the idea, basically, just to add a little bit to your description of how this works, is that you basically have this line at the end of a stick that is measured in a certain number of inches, called a rate. So, like, the rate of silver as an element, if you were looking for it buried underground, would be, I think, 22 inches, maybe something else. But the whirl, or the kind of pendulum swinging in a certain way, would occur a certain number of times. So you'd have the length and the whirl that would happen consistently with certain elements. And he would also, so it wasn't just metals or elements, or it would also be, he would have assigned a certain rate or length of string to find a certain type of wood, a certain herb. He could also try and determine by an emanation that came off of an object that someone might have used, their particular emotional point of view. So he ascribed to the idea of mana, he called it, or emanations that leave a kind of vibratory imprint. And he talks a lot about vibrations. It's through vibrations, or a certain vibrational rate, that the pendulum is, he believes, able to determine what something is to a certain degree. And he thinks that this was a kind of an ancient technology that was known to people, thousands of years ago, but somehow got lost over millennia or however long. Just a bit about history. He got the idea to use the pendulum by a French brigadier, a soldier who was poring over maps and trying to determine where mines were over the sea. So he got inspired by this idea because this French brigadier, who wrote about detecting dangerous mines for shipping vessels that might blow up their vessels, and had some success in determining where these mines might be, it made an impact on him. So why not? If this guy was using such a kind of low-end technology for such an important aim, he might as well try it himself. So I thought that was an interesting thing.
Well, just on that, just another little anecdote based or related to that. I think it was in this book I was reading recently, American Cosmic, by an American religious studies professor. And she was talking about how in the military, even today, there are, like, in every unit. Now, I don't know, because I haven't spoken to guys in the military, but this is what she was basically saying, that in the units, at least that she'd talked with members of, that each of these units had a guy, like, in the mine detecting, like, part of the team, that was, like, kind of had a sixth sense about finding mines and avoiding mines. And so each kind of military grouping would just implicitly trust this guy because he had a record of just knowing where mines were. And of course, this was perhaps in reference to the remote viewing tests that the military was doing back in the 70s and 80s. But just even like aside from that actual, like the actual official interest in parapsychology in the military, that it was purely a practical measure. That when you're in an environment where it's life or death, it's like, again, you don't care whether you believe in the stuff or not, you just use what works. And it seems like there are individuals who are just better at guessing where minds are. And so you naturally just say, okay, well, you're in charge now. You know, the guy's probably thinking, oh, geez. But there are individuals like that, right? And so it's like same thing in the example that you just gave about the brigadier. It's like that's a situation where you have a deficit in knowledge, right? You don't know where these minds are, but it's a life and death situation. So you're going to try whatever you can to get the answer, and it just so happens that some of these methods actually work, you know, whether you believe in them or not. And so that also relates back to the idea, you know, with, you know, me and my pendulum, is that, and this relates back to like First Sight and Carpenter, about there being a need for the information. Like I'd guess, I don't know if there have been any studies like this in the, you know, in all the parapsychological research, but I'd guess, based on reading Carpenter's work, that you'll probably find better results when the information isn't immediately knowable by other means. It's like when it can only be verified kind of after the fact. It's like when you're doing a test, you know, you put 3 items under cups and you move them around, and then you're kind of, you know, using your pendulum to find which one is which. Well, subconsciously, like your sub or superconscious is going to be saying, well, you know, we could tell you the answer, but all you have to do is pick up the cup to find out. It's like you don't need any kind of special skill in order to find it out. It's like if there are three sites located, like, you know, in different countries, and you have only a limited amount of money and you need to find certain things, it's like in that case, it's like it's not easy to check each one. Or to check, you know, it's not easy to like conduct a random search of like the entire like Australian, you know, continent to find out where one particular object is. Well, you're going to need something to help you find it. In that case, the only thing you could do is trust or experiment with some kind of, you know, alternative technique, like, you know, like dowsing on a map or something. So I think there might be a link there between like the lack of information and the lack of ready, like, availability of the information, and that kind of like affirming a subconscious recognition of that okay, we have no way of actually no easy way of finding this information or immediately verifying it. Therefore, there's like an extra need to use the non-sensory means of finding that information and like giving a signal as to where it is.
And you could say that Lethbridge's need for discerning all of this information, you know, using the pendulum, was based on that dilemma, that fundamental dilemma. He saw that kind of crisis of faith in, you know, traditional religious structures, the traditional academic community, and, you know, traditional, just, you know, modern society, and especially, you know, Darwinism. Throughout the book, he's peppered all of those little anecdotes of his, you know, issues with all of these things, and you get the impression that that's the driving force, that's the fundamental need that could stand as a barrier between just the average Joe replicating the kind of information that he has. That could be a possible barrier. But I think, you know, just to answer your question about whether or not you can replicate this data, it's like that, you know, that's just a matter of just giving it a shot, you know, reading down like his methods and just trying to replicate them the best that you can. And then, you know, understanding that, you know, a lot of us probably don't have, you know, just intrinsic dowsing kind of, you know, psychic abilities, but that, as we've seen from, you know, our reading on First Sight, the shows that we've done on First Sight and parapsychology, that it seems like it's a fairly universal phenomenon, that, you know, even if we're not consciously able to access it, that under certain conditions, it's more readily accessible than others. And one of the big ones that you pointed out is needing the information that you're seeking and not being able to get it through other means. And so that's where I think the drive and the quest that Lethbridge had was really was the driving force that really opened up, this entire world to him. That, like you said before, it seemed very inspired because, like you said, there's many inferential leaps from the spinning of a pendulum to the knowledge of how many levels there are to reality, which we haven't gotten to that point yet. But I think that just at the very foundation, I can see where he's coming from, because if you were able to replicate the findings that whenever you were looking for silver, or you're thinking about anger, or you're thinking about love, or you're thinking about women or gold or any of these other things, and you consistently get the same mechanical response from the dowsing rod, then you have to think that there is something objective out there somewhere, right, some sort of a coordinate system that responds to that, and that you're picking up on it through some sort of psychic electromagnetic type of energy, and that it's coming down and it's interacting with physical reality. And and then once you start thinking about things that way, then it's like you've opened up a whole new world of potential, ways of investigating the cosmic mind, essentially.
So we're going to have to set up a series of tests and do another show to show our results, because I think we'd have to take into account at least a couple things. One would be to conduct these tests with people. Well, first we might have a sample of people, right? And set up some kind of simple test to see who might be the most talented with the pendulum. See if there's anyone with a kind of natural ability at this sort of thing. And then hopefully that person has no prior knowledge of Lethbridge's specific system or results. But with the information and with the intent to confirm whether there are these consistencies, right? So like whether you can get consistently a certain length of string and number of circles for like silver compared to gold or something. And then see if you can get consistent results that are repeatable over time. And then only after that, see if those numbers are the same as Lethbridge's numbers. Because at least hypothetically, I think it's possible to get consistent results, but that are different results. That's why I think that the test should be done to see whether like Lethbridge's specific results are universal, or whether that was a product of his mind. Because you could get someone, again, like hypothetically, if you have a really good dowser, you might be able to find someone who gets just as consistent results, but that has completely different like signatures for each metal, for instance. So what if someone else consistently gets like 20 inches for silver as opposed to 22 or whatever it was, and they have their own like unique system. Like, so the question would be whether those numbers are inherent in the things in themselves, or if those numbers are a kind of code that are only signifying or like hinting at an objective quality of the thing in itself. Like just like any other language, it's like is 22 inches like the actual essence of the thing in itself, or is it just like a letter or a symbol for that essence, for that thing in itself?
He actually makes reference to us as decoders. That this table that we have the cameras and our paperwork and our books and our water and our cigarettes on is not exactly as we would interpret it to be, but that exists on another level of reality, and that we're decoding it based on a limited based sensatorium of criteria, if that makes any sense.
Right. He says that the brain is the sensor for Earth level reality. That's how he describes like the brain consciousness. The brain is a sensor. It's
a sensor, and he's also careful to, I think, in one place, make the distinction between the brain and the mind, which is what I really appreciate about his work too.
Let me just interrupt there. I'll give his definitions. Like right at the beginning, he gives his terminology to distinguish these things. So he says he uses these words, so he defines them. Body, he just means body. But by soul, he's referring to individual consciousness. And then by spirit, he's referring to mind, possibly much more extensive. And then when he's talking about brain, he says it's the sensor for Earth level thinking. So those are the distinctions he makes there.
Yeah. And getting back to that point you were making a little earlier, Harrison, where about this consistency, this kind of across the board, data points that we can look at as an objective reality of how the pendulum reacts and responds to certain things. By way of analogy, he says that when he's gotten a lot of letters from readers, he mentions, and one of the things that he's read a lot about and has been written to on the subject of were people having out-of-body experiences, people who have, because they've been in a car accident or were sickly and might have been close to death, or even just in bed asleep, and have for whatever reason their consciousness left their physicality. Across the board, there always seems to be this vantage or viewpoint of the people of a certain number of feet in the air and just off to the side, which he considers to be consistent with the number of whirls and the certain rate or distance that you would computate using a pendulum, if such a thing were measurable, to indicate that we're kind of constructed this in a similar way. I don't know how clear that is, but the way he describes it, it's quite clear. Corey's got a look on his face, folks. We got to look at Corey. He's. Go ahead, Corey. Tell me.
Okay,
clarify.
so all right. So what I was thinking when you're discussing the whirls and the activity of the pendulum, I was thinking about the show we did on that book, Consciousness, Anatomy of the Soul, where they talk about attractors, and in the mathematics, the attractors are different ways that these systems can behave. So you have chaotic attractors, and you have they all behave differently. So in like the very simplest system is just like what I don't think the pendulum would even move, but it would
move back and forth.
It would just move back and forth, correct? So then the spinning around, that's a next level attractor. And in that book, they discussed about the fact that they found that as consciousness rises, there's different attractor levels. I can't think of the proper way. Do you remember how they discussed that? There's like linear attractors, there's chaotic attractors, and so like the solar system behaves in one attractor type way,
and they've each got like I can't remember the phrase, but like a dimensional number.
A dimension, yeah.
So you can calculate the number of dimensions needed in order to like mathematically represent that system. Mm-hmm. So like like a very simple, like I think it's the point attractor is like one dimension, and then you've got the I don't know, simple attractor or something is 2 dimensions, and then when they get up to 3+ dimensions, then at some point the more dimensions you have, that's when it becomes chaotic. It's like and they're quantum like that, like they jump from one to the other. Mm-hmm. It's like there's no I'll stop there because I'd just be talking nonsense because I don't know math.
Well, yeah, I don't know math either, but I remember in the book they discussed the fact that they thought that consciousness kind of came out of a mathematical type dimension, right? And whatever causes the pendulum to act in the way it does, it acts in a way that's similar to these different attractors. Mm-hmm. That there's when the whirl is one, and then just back and forth is another one. And so it just sparked my curiosity to wonder if there's any way that you can look at the two phenomena and see if there is there at root something similar going on between the consciousness in the anatomy of the soul and the different consciousness attractors and the different kinds of behavior of the dowsing rod or the pendulum.
Well, the one part that that's described in the book that seems to approach that idea, he talks about the subconscious or the kind of lower motivations of the human being versus the superconscious or higher dimensional part of the self that is said to exist. I mean, this is part of the conclusion that he's come to after so many years of thinking about and experimenting with the pendulum, that there is a higher dimensional self that exists on worlds, if you were thinking about it in terms of the swinging of the pendulum, that think on another level. And he actually, I don't think that answers your question at all, Corey. But
No, it doesn't. It's not even close. But I like where you're going with it.
So something else that he seems to incorporate in his study is the idea that that there is memory and consciousness and awareness that exists not only when we sleep or when we've left our bodies, but after death. So he also attributes certain places in the distance of a physical body to where the consciousness would reside if they were, for instance, if they had left their bodies completely and gone into an afterlife. And he incorporates this so seamlessly into how he describes this. If you've ever read anything on the subject of an afterlife existence, and there is a large amount of literature to suggest that that's a possibility. He's able to just put that idea right in there. Another thing I wanted to mention, which seems to suggest that he's so ahead of his time, he talks about animal telepathy. He talks about being able to, command his cat to come over here or to leave a certain space or something, and that his cat would, at a distance even, respond to his wishes. And it just reminded me of Rupert Sheldrake's research with animals predicting, when their owner would come home, and it predates Sheldrake's research by decades. So it's just another area that he pulls in that just impresses me.
Well, I'll throw one more thing onto the table to add to our speculation and our possible future experimentation. So in the introduction, Colin Wilson kind of summarizes a bit about the overall worldview that Lethbridge has kind of developed, or that he did develop over the years throughout his books. Because like Colin Wilson says, he didn't just come up with a whole bunch of ideas in his first book and then just rehash them and expand on them in the other books. That his thought changed and morphed and grew over time and developed over time. So new ideas would come in, new interpretations would come in till he got to this final book. But that one of the main overarching points was that that past events would impress something onto the objects themselves. So a stone or a bullet used in a war hundreds of years ago would still resonate with the anger and violence of that time now today. So we could basically, and there's a word for psychics who do that kind of thing now. I can't remember what it is, but where they use objects to kind of sense things about the owner or kind of like a psychic canine unit tracking the scent. Essentially, it's okay, this object, the owner of this object is missing, and they were murdered and their body it should be here, right? Something like that for the kind of psychics that police might use. Again, another example of not necessarily believing, but doing it because it works, whether you believe it or not. So that objects can acquire the impression of past events that gets carried on, and that Lethbridge kind of hypothesized that, or theorized that this had something to do with a field, like the electromagnetic field, something about the field of moving water, for instance. There's something about the fields produced by certain phenomena, and he'd say not only moving water, but potentially also by desert landscapes or mountains that receive the impression of emotions. Because like I said, with the example of the ancient bullet or stone, or any kind of like projectile, that would contain or retain the emotional like significance of that event in which it was involved. And that so that made me think along the lines of some of the stuff that Whitehead was writing about. Because for Whitehead, like Lethbridge, like in a different kind of field, like for Whitehead, everything comes down to vibration. Like the basics of physicality, what we think of as physicality, come down to a vibration, like electromagnetism, like a photon of light. It's like there's wave-like properties to everything, and that is vibratory in nature. And he essentially equated vibration with feeling, with experience. So at the most basic level of reality, the things that we see as vibrations are the objective appearance of the feeling of experience. So energy was, like, you could write a mathematical equation, energy equals feeling. So that, because for Whitehead, every objective thing, everything you could observe and see as an object had its own subjectivity to it. So, like from the inside, there's an inside and an outside to everything. Like when we're looking around the world, we're seeing the outsides of everything, but then from the perspective of that thing, there will be some iota at least of experience, like from the most basic vibratory, like phenomenon up to like human consciousness and above. So those ideas just are kind of they're reminding me of each other. That there's something about the nature of vibration equating to like experience, to like the most basic form of consciousness, and with the pendulum vibrations, and potential like using that to divine something about higher realities, higher consciousness, but also that like if you think about the brain, like the brain, you've got all this electrical activity going on, but there's nothing like intrinsic about a lot of different kinds of like brain cells that distinguishes one from the other. It's not like you have like a specific type of brain cell that receives one type of signal and another specific type of brain cell that receives another signal. It's like you've got a whole bunch of the same kind of neurons that will get signals from various different parts of your body, but that seem to somehow facilitate or produce different sensations or different thoughts. Like because if there was something unique about every different, if there had to be a unique correlation between each type of thought and the physicality of it, you'd need like an infinite number of different types of brain cells in order to have the range of thoughts that we have. We use the same cells to have different thoughts. So like there can't just be this one-to-one correlation. So you've got like the same vibration that can be used for different forms or types of experience, right? So when you have a projectile, an ancient projectile, it's just got its own makeup, right? It's got its own physical makeup that would be like analyzable by any scientist who knows how to do that kind of thing. The elements that make it up, the minerals and whatever that have acquired over time, it's got its own physical stuff that makes it up. But if Lethbridge is right and it can receive the impression of either like anger or potentially like love, if it was part of like a bracelet or a necklace or something that was like given and received and worn with affection, or like, then what is it? Then you can't, like, it's not like the actual physical makeup of that thing was like changed in some way. It's not like it's a difficult physical thing it's not like it's a different physical thing with anger than it is with love. There's something the same about it. It's the same object. It's just that it's like that vibration has just acquired a different symbol to it, a different form of information that's being held in the same medium, essentially. The medium seems to be able to hold a multitude of different types of information, even if it's just one medium that shares the same physical properties.
Well, I just wanted to interrupt Alon really quick. No, I just wanted to add that when you're talking about objects retaining like in some sort of a energetic sequence or in some sort of energetic signature over time. He talks about in the book, Lethbridge talks about, I'm not sure if it's in this book, I can't remember, but of going to Stonehenge and of using the dowsing rod at Stonehenge and saying that it was, that it was like, it was spinning like just out of control, and that he'd repeated this in other kind of energetically, hot spots, and that there was something about it that had, that led him to speculate that this knowledge was something that we had years, or this that has been lost to mankind. And when you think about it, when you're talking about these things and this ability to read it, if it's true, it does make you feel like you're in like Plato's cave. I think when you're reading it, you feel like you're in the dark in terms of seeing all of this detail that's, like you said, this emotional signature in stones, and it could be in houses. As Lethbridge says, it's it can result in ghosts. There's a signature that can result in what he calls ghouls, where he would feel like just this evil presence in an area, and then find out that it was due to something horrible that had happened in the past, and that there's something in the area he speculated had retained that. Water had retained that signature. And you really get the impression that for most of us, if this was knowledge that humanity had millennia ago, at this point we're just blind, stumbling around, groping in the dark for things that are just so many magnitude higher and more fundamental and important to people. All of these different things.
Well, well, just to quickly get back to your point, Harrison, about that stone retaining either the anger or the love or whatever emotion or signature or imprint or mana that it might have received from the person using it. It might be, I was just thinking, maybe there is a physical change, a vibration that is so subtle that it can only be measured by instrumentation or technology that I am currently unaware of. So just offering that up as a possibility. So another point that I thought we'd get to or get back to is how he intuits intelligent design without actually stating that the world is that the world must have a creator. Actually, he does come out and say that. So this is from a chapter called Heredity. And what he says is, the orders of nature known as the invertebrates seem even more convincing than any birds or mammals. Just look at a crab, for instance, when you were getting it ready for eating. Can anybody really believe that all those complicated armored joints reached their present shapes by each successive ancestral crab type adding something more efficient to the general family of crabs? Where did all those bristles on its legs come from? And how did it learn to extract calcium carbonate from the water to provide it with protection? As it grows bigger, it has to cast off that relatively impenetrable covering and hide naked under a rock until it can draw more calcium carbonate to it to form a new shell. Presumably, this elaborate process feels like death and a new birth to a crab. But how did it learn to do it? Actually, there are very early fossil crabs in the geological record, and they are obviously crabs already. It would appear that there must have been blueprints for each type of crab, or how else could the cells of which they are composed possibly have developed? If you give each cell the wisdom of Solomon, it could not have thought out what to do. Some other entity must have thought up the plans and drawn the blueprints. I mean, that's intelligent design. Circa 1970, 1971. So there's something else that seems to be at work here in terms of Lethbridge as a kind of living example of tapping into this type of knowledge that that we're not brought up thinking about or accepting or considering. And that is that it's all kind of related in a way. I mean, yes, you wouldn't exactly say that he was a man of science, but he was a man of knowledge. He was thinking on things as deeply as possible, and had an intimate respect for nature and the environment. But look at all the things that connects to. So we just mentioned intelligent design. He also discusses at length the messages he's received in dreams that have been borne out a few days later in letters that he's written, letters that he's received, or things that people have said to him. So he's observed himself as a kind of receiver of telepathic information, for lack of a better description. So I'm just, you said before, Corey, that he, it kind of reminds you of how much in the dark we all are in terms of our relationship to reality, and it's it also kind of opens up the door in a way, because if we were to engage some of this, very low tech, very easy to use technology, and just test it out as you propose we might do in the future, Harrison, what might we open our ideas and minds to in areas that we might not even anticipate right
Space
now?
travel.
Space travel.
High-speed space travel. That's my first goal.
No, but you know what I mean? It's kind of like it's kind of like a foray into using the mind in ways that we're not traditionally used to using it, and kind of exercising a faculty for perception and for understanding that, at least in theory, I have yet to try all this.
Well, yeah, what he's saying is that there is a super consciousness that is so far above human consciousness that there are very, very few people who can tap into it, and that there's barriers. There's just natural barriers for whatever reason between the Earth world and super consciousness. You can catch glimpses of it sometimes in very meaningful dreams. That there's a reason why sometimes dreams can take place, and you can get an idea of the future events in just an ordinary dream. Something that, and I'm sure many of our listeners and we in particular have had dreams that were prophetic in some way, even if it was mundane, but they were prophetic, and you're just kind of struck by, well, how the heck do I know the future in a dream? And so, he's talking about this level of the super consciousness that exists outside of this very restricted cave-like world that we live in, and that we can use instrumentation in order to get some kind of an idea of, it can deliver messages. That basically it can deliver messages to us. Just like Campbell was writing in First Sight, the book on Psi, that there is a consciousness that's far beyond our own, that exists outside of space and time, and that can then, if certain people are more sensitive to it than others, but that we can tap into that information. But it seems like, from what we've read, that you kind of have to have some sort of an orientation towards it. You have to have the proper attitude towards life. You have to be seeking. You have to be open to the information. You have to have exhausted, the limited capabilities that are there for you, because like you pointed out, Harrison, if you're just playing a game of, find the ball under the cup, your super consciousness isn't going to oh, here, let me give you the answer. That's not, according to this way of seeing it, that's not how it works. It's much more like, if you are in desperate need of the answer, then maybe I'll help. But you're just the point of life is to struggle and to seek answers on your own. And if we know that as humans, then what more could, a super consciousness is obviously vastly more aware, is willing to allow you to fumble around in the dark until you actually do approach it with that, the correct attitude, with the correct willingness to open yourself up to answers that, that could possibly, that are sometimes mind-blowing.
And the benefit of stumbling around in the dark, as all of us are used to doing to some degree or another, I think, is that once you have found something, once something makes a certain amount of sense on a deeper level, on an intrinsic level, then what comes with that is a kind of conviction. It becomes, it becomes locked in, and it becomes part of your system, your being. In any case, folks, we certainly haven't exhausted this subject by any means. It's a rather large topic. I think the idea of actually engaging this is a great idea through experimentation. I think if anyone does try this at home, keep in mind that even if it doesn't appear that you have a natural knack for it, Lethbridge does say that these abilities can be developed to some degree or another. But certainly if you're listening to this show and if you've enjoyed some of our shows in the past, chances are you're pretty smart, you have great intuition, some psychic abilities, and have some link to the supraconscious. I'm half kidding, of course. But I think we'll, unless anyone else would like to add anything, I think we're gonna.
And if you do experiment, just send us the details. That'd be cool.
Yeah,
I'd like to know that.
Or take a video and put it on YouTube, and so we can watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on that note, thanks for listening, and y'all have a great week, and we'll see you again soon. And don't forget to hit like and smash and and subscribe.
Subscribe to Smash.
Subscribe to Smash. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.